The next session, which we're going to do today, is in respect to keeping a market focus during modernisation. And we have two fantastic speakers, Rosemary Richards and Pat O'Shaughnessy. Maybe we start with Rosemary. And Rosemary, I'm going to give a very quick bio on you, because you've had so many fantastic years in the industry and you're continuing to a great contribution. And so I think you've worked more than 20 years in the industry as a director of Bowman Richards, and you've been on numerous committees, including at GTA, representing both on the domestic industry, but also many committees on an international basis. And I'm not going to run through them. I'm sure you'll talk about them at some stage, but great ambassador for Australia on a number of those committees. Look, Rosemary's going to talk about, I don't want to steal her thunder, but Rosemary's going to talk about the importance of global trade and global trade frameworks, and also an overview of the rules-based framework for global trade and the current pressures and issues on trade and the importance of a strong industry and government partnership. So, Rosemary, without further ado, I'm going to let you present. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jason. Really appreciate the introduction, and it's very nice to be able to talk to everyone, even if it is virtually in a different world we live in. Probably going to be a little bit of a different change of pace to some of the sort of more technical sessions that you've probably had this morning. But as Jason said, really sort of, so I'll just try and put that into slideshow. I can just do that. Sorry about that. Probably a bit of a different change of pace and sort of look at some of the more global frameworks that we operate in, and then how the global grain industry collaborates to facilitate trade. And I think one of the things that through GTA and the grains industry, we actually do things very well at a global level in a collaborative manner, and way that we work together, and that reputation that reputation and way that we work together globally has really helped get the global industry at the table for a lot of the frameworks that I'm going to talk about today. So all this, but trade is very important for the grains industry. We say it here in Australia, but it's the same globally as well. And that graph on the right sort of shows you the import penetration that we have across global consumption across a range of grains, between that 20 to 50% import penetration, and that's probably only going to grow. And I think, in terms of trade, it's been very important around food security and meeting that global food and feed demand. And at a global level, we talk a lot about the role that the grains industry plays in moving grain from those areas of surplus to the areas of deficit. So the trade is really important, and so having the right trade frameworks is really important for the industry to be able to operate. And if you look at some of the demand expectations, there's lots of numbers out there, but FAO says that global food demand will be up 50% by 2050 from sort of 2010, 2012. So it's growing, and we need to ensure that we do have the right frameworks for trade to operate effectively. So most of the people who are trading today will only know the rules-based system. WTO was founded back in the mid-90s, and really, I guess most of the people trading grain today have always traded in that rules-based system. And that was really built from a commitment of globally of countries to a free and open markets, and really has been underpinned by three key principles of non-discrimination, transparency, and mutual benefit. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit later about how those principles are being challenged. And I think some of us who, what we've seen over recent years with the US and China and EU, some of the activities that they've been doing, you can see that the challenge to those principles, and from a range of developing countries as well. So the rules, WTO sets those principles, and then they get reflected on a whole range of agreements and country level policies that govern trade today. But essentially they were about trying to provide predictability and give everyone, developing countries and developed countries, a voice in the system. it has been really successful. So since the mid-90s, when WTO was founded, we have seen trade barriers progressively lowered, particularly tariff barriers, and a lot of domestic support programs. And that has obviously, as we know, via free trade, does generate economic growth. However, what we've seen on the other side is obviously the growth in non-tariff barriers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It certainly has been something that's been, core to GTA. The box on the right just gives you a little bit of a flavour to what WTO does. Given the time, I'm not going to talk about that in any detail. In addition to WTO and the sort of rules-based framework, there's a whole lot of other supporting conventions and agreements that and institutions that are in place. And I'm not, there's a multitude of these out there. I just want to touch on a few because they are important to the Australian grains industry, and they're all ones that I guess GTA and has played a key role in, or participates in those. Obviously, there's Codex, and I'm sure you've heard Jared talk about Codex and the food safety standards many times. It's a really, really important, underpinning organisation that globally looks after food safety standards. More recently has been the Convention on Biological Diversity, and as part of that, the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. And really, this has been around biotech crops and products derived from biotech crops. It was really the reason the International Grain Trade Coalition was formed in the early days because of the risks that was seen to facilitation of trade from these sort of frameworks coming in to sort of limit the use of biotechnology. And the global grain industry has really played a really important role in ensuring that those treaties all those protocols or conventions can operate to protect the consumers and protect human health and environment, but also allow trade to occur in a relatively efficient way. We still obviously have some issues around regulatory incoherence, and I can talk a bit about that later. And then the last one is International Plant Protection Convention, IPPC. A lot of people are very familiar with that. Obviously sets the phytosanitary standards measures around the world, and is something that in the grain trade we deal with every day. My screen is sort of stuck. Okay, so as I said, I mean, really, we've all probably just known, most of us trading in the last 20 few decades have really known a rules-based system. But I think what we're seeing today is that that's really at a bit of a crossroads. So, today that rules-based trading system, that spirit of multilateralism really has reached a bit of a fork. And that's really been driven a lot by the trade tensions that we've seen between the US and China, and now being obviously played out with China a lot more broadly across the world. So I think we're at sort of a fork in the road, if you like. Really now it's whether with some of the changes in the political politics, political people around the world, whether we can go back to restoring that trust and confidence in the system and update the system to accommodate for modern challenges, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Or are those trade tensions going to continue, and are we going to see continued growth in protectionism, which we've seen a little bit over the last few years? And one of the reasons that I guess that fork or that crossroads has emerged is that in some senses the global rules haven't actually kept pace with some of the things that have been happening over the last 2 decades. So in the early days of the GATT negotiations, there was really good progress made around multilateral negotiations. Essentially, we haven't really seen much progress on that since the Uruguay round. They've really stalled, and some of that has been related to Article 20, which provides some opportunities for developing countries, and China is seen as a developing country to if you like, game the rules a little bit. But one of the other things that we've seen really in the last decade, particularly in the last 5 years in Australia, is really the rise in bilateral and regional trade agreements. So I think in terms of Australia, we've gone from, in the last sort of 5 years so we've gone from 25% of our trade to almost 90% of our trade now covered under bilateral and regional trade agreements. So and that's been happening all around the world, not just with China, but globally. And so, that's sort of put a bit of pressure on the multilateral negotiation framework. Greater participation of emerging and developing economies, and China coming into WTO has certainly, made some change the rules a little bit. But just going back to the previous session that Emma was talking about, technology advances, I think the rules haven't really kept up with some of the digital disruption that's occurred. The new forms of trade, not so much in grain, but if you look in processed foods, a lot of those, a lot of product now moves through e-commerce channels. So those technology advancements have put pressure on the system, and the rules need to update to do that. And then obviously we've also seen COVID disruptions as well, and there's been a lot of export restrictions and new and perhaps not always transparent support. And so what we've seen over the last few years is that there's been a huge increase in the non-tariff measures. And as I said, GTA has done a lot of work around the non-tariff measures. So we've seen this increasing protectionism, domestic support through non-tariff measures, whilst our tariff barriers have certainly come down. Trade has become more complex and has become more challenging for industry. There's also been a broadening of the landscape as well. So there's a number of new and emerging issues that are coming in to the trading environment now, which the system is trying to grapple with how we deal with those. So in 2015, you had the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, and sustainability is now getting very much put at the heart of a lot of trade policy, and we've certainly seen this with EU in the last little while. Climate change is another one that's challenging the system. There's a lot of trade implications of some of the environmentally friendly food systems that are being developed. There's new alliances being formed around climate change. If you look at the one being led by New Zealand, which has 4 or 5 countries then involved in an agreement around climate change, trade and sustainability. So a lot of challenges coming from those areas. And the last ministerial declaration ministerial meeting under WTO has looked at developing a declaration on sanitary and phytosanitary measures to look at how they can accommodate some of these pressures that are arising through population growth, climate change, technology innovation. So a lot of thinking going on how we do that, but the green industry itself, it's obviously in the way we trade, we need to also think about how we accommodate some of these pressures around sustainability and climate change. So getting to the heart of how does the global grain organise itself, and as I said, we have done a reasonably good job of doing this. So there's been an organisation, the International Grain Trade Coalition. There's been the global coordination for the industry for many years. Really, as I said, this really arose, I guess, around the in response to the Cartagena Protocol, but since then has really broadened its remit to address a number of trade issues. GTA has been a long-standing member of IGTC and has been a very active participant in that for a number of years now. And as you know, Pat O'Shannessy sits on the management committee and is one of the office bearers of that organisation. And a number of us participate on a number of the working groups, including Jared and myself. I guess the focus here has really been for IGTC has really been to pick those issues that have potential to disrupt trade, and then to try and develop a very risk-based and science evidence-based approach to dealing with them. And I think that stood IGCC in really good stead and has allowed both importers and exporters to come together and talk about these issues in a like-minded way. And all the policy positions are consensus driven, and so that means that there's a lot of buy-in and a lot of support. And really in the last few years, IGTC has really got recognised globally for its participation, and it now has seats at the table in a number of international forums, including WTO, IPPC, the Cartagena Protocol and International Grains Council. The current issues that IGTC are looking at are listed there in that table on the right-hand side. I mentioned before that we still have some challenges around regulatory incoherence around the world, and plant breeding innovation is a key example of that. Biotechnology and GM crops have challenged the global grain trade because of the regulations being different in different parts of the world. Plant breeding innovation is another one of those that's challenging in the same way. So it's a high priority issue for IGTC at the moment, as is MRLs, which is a group that Gerard is leading on behalf of the global industry. But GTA also participates in a number of non-IGTC forums. So we've participated in the APEC standards harmonisation. There's an APEC grains NTM project that GTA is involved in currently, the ASEAN NTM business forum. So there is a number of other regional initiatives that GTA can get involved in, and I guess they can be very helpful to us to be able to, I guess, take the lead and establish rules or frameworks for developing countries who may not have the same capacity. So that capacity building is really important, and there is opportunity working through some of those regional initiatives to set those frameworks for regions and help build the capacity to support that. So there is a need for the continuous improvement of the trading relationship, and this is a government and industry approach. So the Australian government has been very supportive of the rules-based global trading system, and their current priorities are around working through WTO to update the rule book, to maintain an effective dispute settlement system, and that has certainly been in the last decade or so. The dispute settlement activity of WTO has been very highly used, and addressing some of the institutional challenges. So some of these definitional things around developing countries and supports and how we manage some of those, and the dispute resolution system is also under pressure at the moment through actions of some of the countries. But I think one of the other things that we've heard from our new trade minister more recently is that diplomacy and relationships are going to be moved back to being a central component for the government's agenda, and that is very important. And I think it's something that perhaps it's been we've focused very much on some of these bilateral and regional negotiations, but bringing diplomacy back as a central component is very important. And that's because we do need to build substantive and enduring connections to have good trade environments. And I guess at an industry level, we've seen that, and also at government level, and also between governments and industry. So there's roles for both of us, both parties, in doing that. And from an industry perspective, one of the things that GTA has looked at building is trade association and cooperation. So association to association cooperation across countries. And, certainly taking something like a country like China, where obviously we've got a number of pressures at the moment in that relationship. At the industry association to industry association level, it's actually still very cooperative and actually helps us in that dialogue. The whole today has been talking a lot about modernising grain systems and supply chains, and that's really important to accommodate some of those disruptions that I talked about in terms of sustainability and technology, etc. There's been a huge focus between with the NTM report around how we actually improve and harmonise across a number of areas, a number of issues across countries. And that's certainly a high priority focus. And we can talk about some of those in questions if you like. I know that I'm probably already over my time. And as I said, the other thing is regional trade enhancement can really also help progress trade relationships. So just quickly to summarise, Jason, as we know, global grain trade is important, it is growing, and we play a really important role in that food security. The rules-based framework has been very effective in lowering trade barriers, and that's really helped generate economic growth across the world. But as we've seen those lowering of trade barriers in terms of tariffs, we have seen this increase in non-tariff measures and domestic support, in particularly across a number of our trading partners like in Southeast Asia. There's been and China. There's been this increase in non-tariff barriers that's really I guess offsetting at the moment some of the gains that we've made in lowering trade barriers. The government remains very committed to multilateral efforts, and I think we, from GTA's perspective, we see that as important. But I think one of the things that we need to focus on is that partnership that you mentioned in the introduction. Is the partnership between government and industry is really probably more important than ever, given some of the complex issues that we now have to deal with. And as we get some of these new disruptions through things like technology, through COVID, through technology and sustainability and climate change, we're in a different environment, and it's really important that government understand what industry can and can't do, and that we can help provide some technical solutions to government to help move those frameworks forward in a more usable factor. So we do need to align the trade policy on those future issues, and we need to feature fit the rules-based system that we have to meet that. But I think a positive for the grains industry is that we do have very effective processes for coordinating activities, and that reputation and recognition that IGTC has built has really given us a seat at the table to be part of those discussions in the global framework. And I think that is something that's very positive for the industry, and I hopefully will help be part of that conversation with government to set the priorities so that we can ensure in that fork in the road that we go the right way and we do move to that more, we can move back to that trust and confidence in the rules-based system. So thanks, Jason. I'll leave it there and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Rosemary, for a really great presentation. And I think one thing important that I always notice when Rosemary presents or provides a paper is you always have a lot of questions, and because you provide a lot of interesting detail. And whilst I always think I'm over all that detail, there's always something there that is of interest. I just want to ask one question, Rosemary, and that's on data harmonisation. How do you think we can achieve that, both in Australia, but more importantly on an international basis?
Yeah, I think in a way, COVID has probably really helped us in the whole digital space and data harmonisation. I think there's been a lot of resistance to digitalisation of a lot of the activities that we do, and as Emma's talked about, and as we know through that Covantus, we are quite a paper-based system. But I think countries have had to move, and so I think in a way that will really help. But I've just been doing some work in the food industry sector, and the whole data harmonisation is a really big issue for them because there's so much hot IP around the product formulations and that they have, and so trying to get some consistency across the countries is really, really difficult. It's and when you look across Southeast Asia, they all have the same process, but the detail of what they require is really different. And so I think, I think the way that we do need to work through the regional frameworks to get that data harmonisation. I think trying to do that globally is very difficult. I think if we can work at regional levels and then build that up, get those frameworks accepted at a regional level, and then you can populate them more widely. And I think that's something that we've, Pat will know, we've talked about a lot with in IGTC, is to perhaps use APEC as a spearhead, where we've got a lot of like-minded countries, and there's a goodwill to build a lot of capacity development, because in a lot of those countries they don't have the capacity yet to put in place some of the processes and protocols in their own country, because they don't necessarily have the same capacity and capability to do that. So I think if we can use some of these regional frameworks as a building block, and then you can perhaps move that forward more globally. But yeah, it's not going to be a quick process.
Thanks, Rosemary. And look, Rosemary's going to stay on the line, and after Pat O'Shaughnessy's presentation, we'll have a few more minutes to ask questions. So I encourage you to put your questions on the Q&A. So let's move over to Pat O'Shaughnessy, and I'm not quite sure that we actually need to introduce Pat, but just a few little bit of background on Pat. Pat's been the CEO of Grain Trade Australia since late 2016. But prior to that, he worked in a number of companies, both here in Australia and North America, predominantly in the trading and business development areas. Pat is really good at understanding between industry and the commercial aspects, and also with government as well. And I think, look, we're going to hear from him today about the Australian industry and government collaboration framework to really assist market access. So over to you, Pat.
Thanks, Jason, and appreciate those kind words. I won't be very long. I think Rosemary's given you a fantastic overview and what we really did. She's ticked all the boxes that we set out there to try and give people a sense of the framework that exists around the global trade, and things just don't happen. There's actually a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to make it all happen, and that was one of the things we wanted to put there. What I did want to just talk about briefly is, this is a supply chain day, and what the hell are we doing talking about market access? Well, the reality is, of course, that everything that goes into our markets needs market access and goes through the supply chain. And in terms of the GTA's fundamentals there, I'll go back a screen, is that trade and market access is a key pillar in the self-regulatory framework that we've talked about a little bit today in terms of standards, contracts, trade rules, but trade and market access is fundamental to that, and without it, it will fall over. So that's why we're talking about it. The other point I wanted to make, and I think Rosemary sort of touched on this, is the fact is that before a grain can be traded to any country in the world, anywhere, from any other place, is that you need market access. And that means you need that multilateral rules.
Sorry, Pat, you just need to move to slide view. I love interrupting the boss.
Sorry, I got slide view here on my other screen, so all right. Is that
you must have shared the you didn't share the slide view version, you've shared the base one.
Yeah, okay. Maybe we'll just keep going with this this version here, and I'll just tick through them as we go. That'll be quicker than trying to sort it all out. So the fact is, around that market access, you actually need, before anyone can trade anything, this work needs to be done in the background around the multilateral rule system. Governments need to agree on their phytosanitary protocols, and they also need to agree on the biosecurity issues around that. So that's something that don't take anything for granted, that's needed. Then once the grain is traded, we still need, as government and industry, to invest resources in the implementing the rules, and also to monitor, maintain, improve those rules and arrangements, and also seek to reduce risks and drive efficiencies wherever we can. And Rosemary talked about that. But I think it's one thing that my observation has been is that we sort of think that all these things just happen and take place, but there's a lot of work and a lot of investment that's required from industry and government. And it does actually require industry and government working together to work through all those issues. So I'll touch on that. There are benefits around this, and the other thing I'd add about trade and market access is the pace of it. I'm afraid to say it can be pretty glacial. Things don't necessarily happen overnight. You need the agreement of one government and the agreement of another government, and you need to work through those processes. So things can take some time, and patience is a virtue, I guess, in this space. But it is important to work through there. But in terms of industry working on these issues, there's a lot of value for us, and I think we shouldn't underestimate that value. The first one is working with the government and actually building strong relationships with the government, remembering that the government also have to look after all the other different commodities and trade, and so us working with government, helping them to understand our issues as grain and the technical side of it is very, very important, and supporting the bilateral processes and the market access discussions with some expert advice. And a pretty simple example is the interaction, say, that Gerard McMullen would have with government on the chemicals and MRLs, and having that level of expertise there that becomes invaluable. for different commodities, different require different protocols and different requirements in different countries. So it can be complicated, but working to work through that and establish these protocols really just can help to drive efficiency and reduce risks for that as well. As grain marketers or exporters, what keeps you up at night? It's having distressed cargoes. It's having cargoes that can't discharge around that. And all those issues at the end of the day fall back on this market access and phytosanitary area around that. Now, for growers, obviously, having more markets, building more demand, having more options improves return and ongoing access. And also for our processors as well, in terms of processors offshore, but here in Australia as well. I think Rosemary just touched on the processed goods of some of the Food and Grocery Council stuff. It's all important for any of the trade that we need to do. But at the end of the day, being better informed, having better policies and improving efficiency helps to facilitate trade and do it in a more efficient way. But I think often one of the other ways of thinking about this is the risk. It's often quite binary. There's no cost, there's nothing until something goes wrong. And then you're really talking about problems on scale and money on scale. What we do in our approach to it through GTA and also across the Australian industry, I think it's pretty fair to say, Rosemary's touched on the global frameworks, the WTO, those trade frameworks there and working through there. It is a multi-pronged approach around looking at that, looking at the domestic issues, working with the government, and then also supporting government as well through that process, be it technical knowledge, training, providing access to customers, generating a feedback loop, and also providing support to government to say, this is where industry wants to go, this is what industry needs to happen, and working through that. So that's a constant communication and engagement process. And with a lot of this work is you need to do a lot of groundwork. And, we've had a couple of high-profile issues, I guess, in the last couple of years with China and so forth. But you need to do the groundwork to have the relationships in place with the people so that when it hits the fan, so to speak, you know who to go to, who to talk to, and there's a relationship there that people can work with and do that. Business is relationships. A lot of trade and market access is also relationships and having those networks as well. Working with the government on that, the Australian government, there's a group, the Department of Agriculture here have what they call the Grain Plant Board Export Industry Consultative Committee, GPEC as it's known. I've put that up there. There's a number of people on industry that work through that. I sit on that, Jared sits on that as well, and a lot of the exporters as well. But that's the key forum between the government and industry. So it's a consultative process about what are the market access issues, what are the market access priorities, what are the biosecurity concerns. It's the feedback loop between industry and government around export operations, regulatory impacts, and at the end of the day, the costs of operating that thing. So the Department of Agriculture, a lot of the export inspection process is paid for by industry. Exporters will pay about 13, 14 cents a tonne on all exports, and that funds the AOs, the inspections, and a lot of that other department work. So as an industry representative, one of the roles that we do spend quite a bit of time on in terms of engagement with government is also looking at the costs of that and how to drive benefits and processes. And to be honest, that was also a large part of the strategy that the department put forward with David Ironside sort of put together around how can we make that whole process more efficient, because at the end of the day, the industry is paying for that. Now, Rosemary talked about the NTMs, and the fact is that they're going up while tariffs has gone down, and we've talked about how that works at a global level, and the Codex, WTO, IPPC, and the work that's being done there. At an industry level, what we've been doing is developing what we've called there the Grains NTM report, where we've gone out, spoken to the exporters, the importers, the consumers, and captured the issues, and then sort of assessed those, in terms of their impact, their practicality, and prioritise how do we, what should we work on first, second, third, and how can we do that. It's been a very, very, very important communication tool in terms of getting the attention of ministers, getting the attention of the upper levels of management in Department of Agriculture, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and engaging with that. It's a great example of what we need to do as an industry to make sure that our issues are front and centre on the table, getting addressed and working through that. And we've also touched on the way that we can address those globally through counterparts and raising the awareness of these issues. And when we do this, it's in a mutually beneficial way. So the NTMs also impact importers, and what impacts an importer is going to impact the exporter, and so forth through the loop. So working through that at a global level, but really trying to work at a multilateral level rather than trying to work as one country versus another country, which I guess if you look at our relationship with China is not terribly, there can be more productive ways of doing that at times. Stronger connectivity, stronger relationships build stronger markets. That's pretty much, don't worry about reading the stuff after that if you like. That's what we really need to focus on, and that's what our strategies and work is doing it. There's a number of ways of doing that, the connections, the capacity building, collaboration, research, technical services. Importantly, one area that we think that is underdone and very difficult to do is improving understanding at the import and the export side around systems, quality assurance systems, sampling, harmonisation, as we call it, on loading a vessel and unloading a vessel, and how things are tested there. So we'll work through that. But it is very fundamental to what trade and market access is about. It's really about that connectivity, having relationships, and then working on building stronger markets through that. Now, in terms of the China story, won't go into the China story at all, but obviously there's a lot of work being done post-China as to the concentration risks that we had around barley, and also the market diversification that needs to go forth around that, and developing strategies across industry on developing, returning the value, if you like, that's been lost through that, and then also thinking about the bit of the wake-up story in there as well for industry on there. So we are working across industry with grain growers, with AGIC, with GMAF, and looking at developing programs and strategies along these areas around enhancing relationships we talked about, meeting market requirements, the sustainability issues, expanding feed and flour milling human consumption processes. We think there's a big opportunity. We know there's a big opportunity in terms of the Southeast Asian feed market. It's huge, but working on ways in terms of the technical servicing side of that and the market access side of that to get more product in there in a way that's going to grow the pie at the end of the day for their industries, because they've also got their own country issues to sort of about as well. And then one of the areas that we do want to focus on is develop a bit of a strategic market strategy for India. And the reasons for that is not just the fact that India is a huge country with a lot of people that at the end of the day, longer term is probably not going to be able to meet its own food security requirements, but we see that that the government is also pivoting to India strategically around security issues and bilateral trade issues in there as well. So in a sense, it's fishing where the fish are. And what we hope to do out of there is develop a strategy and template and plan that we can then look at rolling into other markets and other areas around that. And a lot of this will also draw on some of the strategic work that's been done with Indonesia on the IA-CEPA arrangements as well. We think that modernising this supply chain issue is fundamental to returning the value that's been lost around the market access issues with China and also other areas. And I put the slide up earlier today. Improving the efficiency of the supply chain will add value to every tonne. Doesn't matter where it goes, every tonne in the supply chain, if we can improve the efficiency of our supply chain as well. And then looking at barley, the barley recovery side of things, and there's been some some trade into South America, looking at doing that too, working through there as well. So there's a lot of work going on in that space. Now, as I said, this stuff can be quite glacial. There'll be milestones and achievements in the short term, but over the longer term, it will still take some time there as well. And I should add one other area that we also want to focus on is also maintaining our trading relationship with China, not just in barley, obviously. One day the tides will turn, but wheat exports going in there at record paces at the moment, and saying longer term, we need to move forward with there. I just want to make one last point on this trade and market access space and some of the work that's done, and I guess some of the money spends, and really it's to flip it around and ask yourself the question, what would happen if we didn't do this? What would happen if there's no global industry collaborative effort, as we called it, or even within Australia? Some of you may not realise that the Cartagena Protocol that Rosemary spoke about, the key achievement out of 15 years worth of advocacy was to include a clause in that agreement to say shipments of grain may contain GM products. So may contain 1 or 2 kernels of corn, may contain 1 or 2 soybean pods around there. But if we didn't have that, every single shipment of grain anywhere in the world would have to be tested for GM products rather than having a clause that says may contain. So think about that. That's quite a bit of testing. Probably if you're a testing company, you'd wish that they didn't do that, I guess, at the end of the day. But also one of the areas, and GTA was instrumental in this, this goes back to around about 9/11, grain would be defined as an explosive substance. So it does explode, the grain dust does explode, but that would have meant the grain would be classified with TNT, ammonium nitrate, all those high explosive things in terms of the cost, the requirements, the security, the overlay in every single site, anywhere you store grain from farm, anywhere in the world, would have had an awful amount of regulatory overlay around there that at the end of the day probably would have drowned a lot of people in that sort of thing. So there are a couple of practical outcomes that took a long time to achieve. The fact that low-level presence is recognised as an acceptable risk mitigation in many areas. And what do I mean by that is that in a cargo of wheat into somewhere, you can get away with a couple of kernels of corn or some other product in there. Ideally not, but it's acceptable to say that achieving zero tolerance on anything is really not very practical. Some of the other areas that there would be was that there was a push globally to establish what we would call commercial quality issues in government-to-government phytosanitary regulations. So, for example, there was a push to include in any commercial contract for grain to say you can have a maximum of 1.5% foreign material as a starting point. And we're sort of pushing back on that. So that was, again, an example of where regulation has the right intentions, but sometimes can end up heading for unintended consequences without the advocacy and the input of industry. And at a global level is this having a non-government agency, if you like, or a non-government advocate for issues, so that if a country pursues an issue or a company pursues an issue, it's going to be met with a little bit of skepticism, a little bit of what's the self-interest angle here. But if you've got a forum of a global view, and particularly a consensus view, so that is the consensus position, that's incredibly powerful. And that's how we've seen the IGTC get into the doorways of things like the WTO, Codex, IPPC, and all these sorts of areas. So think about what would happen if we did nothing in this space. And I think we'd be on a road to nowhere. So I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat, for a great presentation, and there's a lot of food for thought, I guess, in this. I want to ask you one question to start off the questions, and I encourage people to have their questions, put it up on the Q&A. We really encourage as many questions as possible, both for Pat and Rosemary. But Pat, I have one question, and this is sort of a little bit of my own personal interest, but how well placed is GTA and the government to be able to react and deal with some of the trade shocks that we have?
I'll have a look at that. I think, like I said, we're well placed, I think, and it is spending time developing the relationships, raising the awareness of issues, and also when government asks for something, delivering on that. And that's what we do focus on, making sure that we do that. So, you know, an example is perhaps a little bit outside of here is with the wheat pork code review. The government have actually asked GTA to look at some of the industry issues and see whether we can develop an industry position around some of these things. And I think the way I sort of thought about that is that the government wouldn't ask us to do that if they didn't have some confidence in us as an organisation and more broadly as an industry to be able to, you know, reach those sorts of positions.
Thanks, Pat. Rosemary, there's a question for you. There's a lot of complexity in the global grain trading environment. How well do you think it is understood by the actual people trading grain internationally? And if it is not well understood, how do people get access to the information?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Jason. I think obviously, you know, the traders understand the commercial complexities really well. And, you know, there's a point where, and a lot of the things that the trade, things that the IGCC works on are long-term things. And as Pat said, you know, quite glacial, and they're probably not the things that the complexity that the traders are dealing with here and now. Every so often they intersect as it did in the early days of GM, and I guess with the China issue that we've just had. I think it's also, you know, as the companies as global grain companies have consolidated, a lot of that knowledge now is actually in a few people in head office of some of these big grain companies. So some of the commercial people who representatives who participate on IGGC are very knowledgeable about these things, and you know, there's a huge amount of knowledge in some of these individuals in these companies. But I think perhaps you know, sometimes in Australia we don't have some of that knowledge so much at our hands because it's dealt with by the head offices of the companies. A bit different for something like CBH, where, you know, so where you're actually dealing with everything yourselves, but for the global, you know, the global players, it's perhaps a little bit different. But I think the challenge is really some of these things are very long term, and today we know things like sustainability are coming along to hit us, but it's not probably. That's not being seen in the actual trades today because it's not actually hasn't sort of filtered down through the system yet to, you know, to be there. So I think that's the sort of challenge, as Pat said, where, you know, it really takes the industry associations to be looking at these things out 5 to 10 years to deal with those complexities that will actually hit the trade in their day-to-day jobs down the track, and that's the sort of intersection that you're trying to get to, and get people aware that someone needs to be thinking about these things a long way ahead of them actually impacting in the trade today.
You know, I'd add, Jay, I think that you know, if you're trading, you're running risk. It's a pretty here and now type of proposition, and making sure that the next cargo, you know, is going smoothly. And one of the things we've probably lost as an industry, and this is just the way it's been, you know, as we've evolved, is that we've probably got less resources across industry than we had in the days of the marketing boards to look at these things. There were almost departments, if you like, around these things, and it's not a criticism. That's the efficiency that's been driven in the industry. But I think having that longer term view is important. And I think one of the areas I think is that because trading's a here and now thing, and you don't necessarily think of these things until all of a sudden you've got a weed seed in your cargo that's going to cause trouble, you're not going to get an immediate solution. It's going to take time, and that's one of the areas that we, you know, try and, I think we you know, help people understand.
So, Pat or Rosemary, is it the responsibility then of government in this case, or is it the responsibility of industry, or is it joint? And, you know, because industry is always saying, well, it's the responsibility of government, and government is always saying it's the responsibility of industry. How do we get that together?
Look, I think it's a shared responsibility, Jason. I think, you know, government needs industry to really tell them what the priorities are and how, and to come up with some of the technical solutions to how you deal with these things. Because people in government don't have the intimate knowledge of how the grain trade works. And I think that's where IGTC has been very successful. It's actually been trying to educate global policymakers a little bit about how the grain trade works, just the size. I mean, it's always amazing when you go and talk at some of these world forums to, policy people from around the world or politicians from around the world. They really don't know. They really don't have a good understanding of the size, the scope, the complexity of moving grain from one area to another. So I think, industry has to take some responsibility to educate policymakers and to be there to provide the technical solutions and the technical input. But then we need a government that's willing to really, take that argument forward and listen to industry, and then, use that technical knowledge from industry and take that forward. And I think, as Pat said, we've actually done that pretty well in Australia. I think we've got a pretty strong relationship between, industry and government here to actually in that technical space. Maybe in some of the other areas we're not, it's a bit more fragmented, but I think in this technical trade area, there's actually a very good relationship there, and we have been able to pull those technical solutions forward. But at the end of the day, these agreements are government to government negotiations, so industry can't do that. Government has to do that, but I think industry has to sort of push and lead in terms of the priority setting and the technical solutions.
Yeah, just add to that. It's certainly a joint thing, and we do work with the government. I think it's very strong. But at the end of the day, also the profit and the loss is the traders, and so in terms of who pays, who's impacted, yes, everyone is, but at the hip pocket level, it's the traders. So we have a vested interest and call it a responsibility to engage and focus on that to try and reduce those risks.
Look, thank you to you both. We're now over time, but we appreciate both of your presentations. Rosemary Richards, thank you very much, and Pat O'Shannessy. We're going to resume. We're going to take a break for 5 minutes and resume at 2:30 p.m. Thank you.